All right, ready to dive into some CISA module review questions? These are great. We're going way beyond just basic answers, though, right? Think of it more like uh, we're doing a deep dive into the why behind it all and the real-world impact of this stuff, auditing fundamentals.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like having a cheat sheet, but also like we're making sure you get the logic behind it all. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And first up is when you flag, so I think you're already interested in this one, the difference between assessments and audits.
Well, they both involve, some kind of evaluation, right? But think of it this way. An assessment is like a quick checkup, like when you go to the doctor. But an audit, that's like a full medical exam.
Oh, okay. So an assessment is more informal then.
Yeah.
And an audit has to follow like a strict process.
Yeah, spot on. Audits are all about providing a high level of assurance, often
Mhm.
for, compliance or regulatory reasons. They're based on specific standards, which makes them more formal and rigorous.
That makes sense. So like if a company needs to prove to investors that their financial reports are accurate, they'd need a formal audit, not just a casual assessment.
Perfect example. Now, your next couple questions bring up the key players, right? The auditor, the auditee, and the client.
Right, right. The auditor is the one doing the examining, the auditee is the one being examined. But who's the client in all this?
Well, the client is the one who, commissions the audit in the first place. Could be a company, government agency, or even just an individual who needs that independent assurance. They're the ones who kind of set the scope and objectives of the audit,
Mhm.
basically saying, hey, this is what we need you to look at.
Got it. And I bet auditor independence is super important here.
Absolutely crucial, especially when we're talking about external audits. Like, imagine an auditing firm that has a close financial relationship with the company they're auditing. Do you think that would raise some eyebrows about their objectivity?
Definitely a conflict of interest there. Yeah, it would be hard to stay unbiased in that situation.
Exactly. And without that independence, the whole audit loses its purpose. It's like, a referee who's best friends with one of the teams. No one would trust the calls, right?
Now, a few of your questions focus on policies, standards, and guidelines. It seems like there's a kind of hierarchy there. Can you help us break that down?
Okay, so picture this. A company's policies are like its constitution. They set the overall direction, like we value customer data privacy. Then you've got standards, which are more specific rules derived from those policies. Those are like the laws that put those principles into practice. For example, all customer data must be encrypted.
And guidelines would be like expert advice on the best way to follow those laws.
Precisely. They offer recommendations and interpretations, but they're not mandatory like policies and standards are. Think of it like this. You shall follow the law, but you should probably listen to expert advice for the best outcome.
So a guideline might suggest using a certain type of encryption algorithm, even though the standard just says data needs to be encrypted.
Perfect example. And seeing that hierarchy helps you understand the levels of obligation and how they all connect.
All right, let's shift gears a bit to another group of questions. These explore the different types of audits. Seems like there are a lot of options to choose from.
Yeah. You've got external audits where an independent third party comes in, gives an objective assessment, usually for compliance. Then there are internal audits done by the organization's own staff. Those look at the internal controls and processes.
And I'm guessing there are specific audits just for information systems.
You bet. Those focus on the security, effectiveness, and, efficiency of an organization's IT infrastructure. Everything from data security to disaster recovery plans, all about making sure those systems are reliable and secure.
So it's not just about looking at financial numbers. Audits cover a pretty wide range of areas. Now, you've also got some questions about ongoing audit programs. What are those all about?
It's like a continuous feedback loop. Instead of doing a one-time audit, organizations are shifting toward this idea of ongoing monitoring, testing, and improvement, like how you stay on top of your health with regular checkups, right? Instead of waiting for a big problem to drag you to the doctor.
Makes a lot of sense. Being proactive is always better than being reactive, especially when it comes to things like security.
Absolutely. Ongoing programs help catch those potential issues before they turn into huge headaches.
Okay, let's move on to something super important. Ethics and professional conduct for auditors. You've got a few questions digging into that.
This is where it gets interesting. Auditors have a huge, like a really big responsibility. They have access to sensitive information and their opinion really matters. So ethical conduct is, well, It's paramount.
Yeah, they're like the keepers of the keys, right? They got to be super careful and responsible.
That's a great way to put it. ISACA, the organization behind the CISA certification, they have this whole code of ethics, emphasizes things like integrity, objectivity, confidentiality, and competence. It's all about upholding those really high standards of professionalism.
So auditors have to be honest, unbiased, discreet, and good at what they do. That's a lot to live up to.
It is, and your question about fiduciary responsibility, that really highlights this point. Auditors have an obligation to act in the best interests of stakeholders, even if it means disagreeing with the client.
So if they find something fishy, they have to report it, even if the client wants to keep it quiet.
Exactly. It's about putting ethical considerations and the public interest above any personal gain or loyalty to one specific client.
Wow, that adds a whole other layer of complexity and responsibility to being an auditor. Now, let's look at a few questions focused on the nitty-gritty of evidence, opinions, and remediation. Seems like this is where the real action happens in an audit.
Absolutely. The auditor's opinion is only as strong as the evidence they have, right? So they have to be really careful about collecting information that is, sufficient, reliable, and relevant, all to support their findings.
They're like detectives, right? Carefully piecing together all the clues to reach a conclusion.
Great analogy. They review documents, interview people, observe processes, and sometimes they even conduct tests, all to get a complete picture.
And then once they've looked at all the evidence, they form an opinion.
Right. It's their professional judgment based on everything they've found. An unqualified opinion means everything looks good. A qualified opinion means there might be some issues, but not enough to warrant a negative opinion.
And what about when the audit finds problems? That's where remediation comes in.
Exactly. And your question about the auditor's role in that process is important. Ideally, they guide the auditee on how to fix those issues, but they don't actually do the fixing themselves.
So more like a consultant, right? Giving advice and expertise, but leaving the implementation to the organization being audited.
Precisely. It's a balancing act. They offer guidance without taking ownership of the solutions. That helps them stay objective.
Makes sense. It's about letting the auditee fix their own problems. Okay, let's jump into the world of audit documentation and terminology. Got a few questions here that might get a bit technical.
They can be, but understanding the basics is really important. Audit documentation, they often call it work papers, is like a detective's notebook. It's the record of everything the auditor did during the audit. Their procedures, findings, analysis, all of it documented.
So it's about having a clear and auditable trail of their work.
Exactly. This documentation helps ensure the quality and consistency of the audit, provides evidence for their opinion, and can even be used for future audits or for training.
You also had a question about how important it is to protect this documentation. Is that because it might contain sensitive information?
That's a big part of it, yeah. Audit documentation can reveal confidential information about the organization, its processes, and even employees.
So it's like a treasure trove of inside information that needs to be kept under lock and key.
You could say that. Strong security controls are key to keeping this sensitive data away from prying eyes.
Now, one of your questions asked about a little but important difference in audit terminology. The words should and shall.
Ah, yes. Those seemingly small words make a big difference. In audit regulations, shall means it's mandatory, like you have to do it. Should is more of a recommendation, something that's advisable, but not strictly required.
So if a standard says, the auditor shall obtain management's approval, there's no wiggle room there. But if it says the auditor should consider the organization's risk appetite, that's more of a suggestion to inform their judgment.
Precisely. Paying attention to these little words is key to understanding what's required and what might happen if you don't comply.
Like learning a secret decoder ring for audit speak.
That's a great way to put it. Once you crack the code, the whole world of audits becomes a lot less intimidating.
Now, let's tackle something that might keep some auditors up at night. Irregularities and illegal acts. You've got a question about the auditor's responsibilities if they encounter those.
This is a tricky area for sure. It has both legal and ethical dimensions. The auditor has a duty to report any irregularities or illegal acts they discover, but the exact reporting process, that can vary.
So it's not always as simple as calling the cops.
Not necessarily. Sometimes it means reporting to the right level of management within the organization first. Other times, it might require reporting to regulatory bodies or law enforcement.
Really shows how important it is for auditors to understand their legal and ethical obligations.
Absolutely. They need to be prepared to navigate these tough situations and make decisions that protect everyone involved and keep the audit process honest.
Okay, let's move on to a couple of your questions about audit committees and governance. They seem to play a crucial role in making sure organizations are running ethically and responsibly.
Think of audit committees as the guardians of good governance. They're usually made up of independent board members who provide oversight and keep things running smoothly.
Like internal watchdogs, making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Good analogy. They have the power to hire and fire external auditors, review audit findings, and make recommendations to the board and senior management.
So they act as a check on management's power.
Exactly. And good governance is all about ensuring that decisions are made by the right people with accurate information and for the benefit of the organization and its stakeholders.
Creating a culture of accountability and transparency at every level. Now, you flag a question about the difference between threats and vulnerabilities. Those are key concepts in information security, right?
Absolutely crucial. A vulnerability is a weakness, a flaw in a system that could be exploited. Imagine it like a chink in your armor.
And a threat is something that could actually exploit that weakness.
Exactly. Like an enemy soldier looking for a way to get through your defenses. A vulnerability without a threat might not be an immediate problem, but it's still something that needs fixing.
Like a lock and key, right? You need both for there to be a problem.
Great way to visualize it. For example, say a company is storing sensitive data on a server. That server might have vulnerabilities like outdated software, weak passwords, or poorly configured firewalls.
And the threats targeting those vulnerabilities could be anything from hackers to natural disasters or even just human error.
Right. The good news is when you understand how threats and vulnerabilities work together, you can take steps to reduce your risk and strengthen your security.
Like a never-ending game of chess, right? Trying to stay ahead of the attackers.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of the first batch of your CISA review questions.
We've covered a lot, haven't we? From the basic definitions to the ethical side of things. It's clear that auditing is a complex and fascinating field.
Absolutely. And I think we've done a good job explaining why these concepts matter and how they play out in the real world.
I agree. But this is just the beginning. In part 2 of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the more nuanced parts of these CISA questions, and we'll look closer at the challenges and dilemmas that auditors face in their work.
Can't wait. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a quick break.
So I think we've laid some good groundwork. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. We talked about the difference between assessments and audits, who the key players are, and how important ethics are in this whole profession. But I'm kind of curious to go a bit deeper into some of the real-world challenges that auditors face. You had a question about materiality. That one seemed like it could be a bit subjective.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Materiality is all about figuring out if a misstatement or error is big enough to really affect the overall fairness of financial statements. It's not just about whether something's right or wrong, but if it's materially right or wrong.
So a small error might not be a big deal for a huge company, but could be a warning sign for a smaller one.
Exactly. Auditors have to use their judgment and consider things like the size of the company, industry standards, and how it might affect stakeholders to figure out what's material in each case.
Makes sense. It's kind of like deciding which ingredients in a recipe are absolutely essential and which ones you can tweak a little without messing up the whole dish.
Oh, I like that analogy. And your next question about sampling techniques, that ties in with materiality too.
Yeah.
Auditors can't look at every single transaction, so they use sampling to choose a representative portion of the data to analyze.
So it's finding a shortcut that still gives them a good picture of what's going on.
Precisely. They use statistical methods to make sure that sample is big enough and representative enough to make accurate conclusions about the whole data set.
Sounds like you need to know some statistics for that.
You do. Auditors have to choose the right sampling method and be careful about how they interpret the results. Otherwise, they might draw the wrong conclusions.
Okay, you also had a question about the different types of audit opinions. We talked about unqualified and qualified opinions earlier, but it seems like there are a few other variations.
There are. Remember, an unqualified opinion means everything looks good. A qualified opinion means there are some issues, but they're not a big enough deal to give a negative opinion.
Right. But what about an adverse opinion? That sounds pretty serious.
An adverse opinion basically says these financial statements are seriously misstated and don't give an accurate picture. It's a huge red flag for investors and everyone else.
Oh, wow. So if a company gets an adverse opinion, that means there's something seriously wrong.
Definitely. Then you've got the disclaimer of opinion, which means the auditor couldn't get enough information to even form an opinion. It's like saying, we can't tell you if things are good or bad because we don't know enough.
That almost sounds as bad as an adverse opinion. It just creates a lot of uncertainty.
It does. The type of audit opinion can have a big impact on a company's reputation and finances.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about something that's relevant to pretty much anyone working with IT audits. You had a question about the specific areas that are typically covered in those.
Right. IT audits can cover a lot of different things, but some common ones are data security, access controls, change management, disaster recovery planning, and software development lifecycle.
So it's all about making sure that information systems are confidential, accurate, and available when you need them, right?
Exactly. IT auditors are looking for any vulnerabilities that could compromise those key principles and figuring out ways to make things more secure.
And I bet these audits are becoming even more important as we rely on technology more and more.
Absolutely. With data breaches and cyber attacks happening all the time, organizations have to be extra careful about protecting their systems and data.
And speaking of being careful, you also had a question about internal controls and how they help prevent and detect fraud.
Internal controls are like safety nets that help prevent mistakes, catch irregularities, and even stop fraudulent activity. They include things like separating duties, having clear authorization processes, and doing regular reconciliations.
So it's all about having checks and balances to make sure that no one person can get away with something shady.
Precisely. The idea is to make it much harder for fraud to happen and easier to catch it if it does.
Okay, your next question gets into risk assessment, which seems like a really important part of any good audit.
Risk assessment is the foundation of the entire audit. It's about identifying potential weak spots and then tailoring your audit procedures to focus on those high-risk areas.
So it's about working strategically and focusing your resources where they'll have the most impact.
Exactly. By understanding where the biggest risks are, auditors can prioritize their efforts and focus on the areas that are most likely to have problems.
That makes a lot of sense. And it seems like this risk assessment process would involve a lot of collaboration with the organization being audited.
Absolutely. Auditors need to understand the organization's operations, what industry they're in, and their specific risk profile. It's a team effort for sure.
Now, you also had a question about a specific type of audit, a performance audit. What's the main focus of those?
Performance audits go beyond just making sure you're following the rules. They also look at how efficient, effective, and economical an organization's operations are.
So it's not just about doing things right, but about doing them well.
That's a great way to put it. Performance audits can find areas where resources are being wasted, processes are inefficient, or where results aren't meeting expectations.
And that information can be used to improve things and get better results, right?
Exactly. Performance audits are a great way to make organizations more efficient and effective.
Okay, let's talk about a concept that comes up a lot in auditing due professional care. You had a question about what that actually means for auditors.
Due professional care is all about being diligent, skeptical, and using good professional judgment throughout the audit.
So it's not just about going through the motions, but about being thorough and using critical thinking skills.
Precisely. Auditors need to be able to spot red flags, question assumptions, and gather enough evidence to support their conclusions.
And they have to do all that while staying independent and objective.
Absolutely. Due professional care is all about upholding those professional standards and making sure the audit is fair and thorough.
Okay, you also asked a question about audit evidence. We talked about gathering evidence before, but it seems like there are different types with different levels of reliability.
Right. Auditors use a lot of different sources of evidence: physical evidence, documentary evidence, testimonial evidence, and analytical evidence.
So physical evidence would be things like inventory, and documentary evidence would be things like invoices or contracts.
Exactly. Testimonial evidence comes from talking to employees or management, and analytical evidence might involve comparing financial data over time.
And I'm guessing some types of evidence are considered more reliable than others.
You got it. Evidence that the auditor gathers directly is usually seen as more reliable than evidence they get from other sources.
So actually counting inventory is better than just looking at a report that the company prepared.
Exactly. And documents from outside sources are generally more reliable than ones created internally.
It's about considering the source and whether there's a chance of bias. Now, your next question gets into audit risk. What are the different types of audit risk that auditors have to think about?
Audit risk is basically the risk that the auditor misses something important. a material misstatement in the financial statements. There are three main types: inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk.
Okay, so inherent risk is the risk of a problem happening in the first place, even if there are controls in place.
Exactly. Some industries or types of transactions are just riskier than others.
And control risk is the risk that the organization's own internal controls don't catch or prevent those errors.
Right. And then detection risk is the risk that the auditor's own procedures miss an error.
So it's like a combination of things that could lead to a wrong audit opinion.
Precisely. Auditors need to think about all three types of risk to come up with a good audit plan.
Now, let's talk about a specific kind of control that's important in IT audits: application controls. What are those, and how are they different from other controls?
Application controls are specific to individual software programs and are designed to make sure that the data processed by those programs is accurate, complete, and valid. They work at the transaction level, unlike general IT controls, which apply to the whole IT environment.
So general IT controls would be things like password security or system backups, while application controls would be more about making sure data is entered correctly or transactions are properly authorized.
That's a great way to think about it. Application controls are super important for keeping data accurate and preventing errors or fraud within specific applications.
Now, your next question is about auditing around the computer. What does that even mean?
Auditing around the computer means looking at what goes into a system and what comes out of it without examining the actual code and processing that happens in between. It's like treating the computer system as a black box.
So instead of looking at the code, they're looking at the data that goes in and the information that comes out to see if it's accurate.
Exactly. This was more common back when computer systems were simpler. But now, with everything so complex and interconnected, auditing through the computer is becoming more important.
And what does auditing through the computer involve?
That means using special audit software and techniques to examine the inner workings of a computer system, the code, data structures, and processing logic. This lets auditors really understand how the system works and find any vulnerabilities or control weaknesses.
It's like looking under the hood to see how the engine runs.
Perfect analogy. Auditing through the computer gives a much more complete and detailed view of the system's controls and risks.
Now, you also had a question about continuous auditing. How is that different from a traditional audit?
Continuous auditing means using technology to monitor and analyze data in real time or almost real time. This means auditors can constantly check things and find potential issues as they happen, rather than waiting for a scheduled audit.
So it's like having your finger on the pulse of the organization all the time, rather than just taking a snapshot every now and then.
That's it. Continuous auditing is a much more proactive way to manage risk, and it lets organizations react to problems quickly and efficiently.
It sounds like a powerful tool for making things more transparent and accountable.
It really is. And it's becoming more and more important as things change so rapidly, and organizations are under more pressure to manage risk effectively.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We talked about materiality, sampling, the different audit opinions, and the changing world of IT audits. We also got into internal controls, risk assessment, and the importance of due professional care.
It's been quite a journey so far, but we're not finished yet. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll wrap up these CISA review questions and leave you with some key takeaways and some food for thought.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've gone through a ton of info, from basic assessments to the nitty-gritty of evidence and risk. Now let's finish up these CISA review questions.
And give you some good takeaways that you can actually use whether you're an auditor yourself or just someone who works with information systems and data security.
Exactly. So your last question focuses on data analytics in auditing, which seems super relevant these days with all the data we have.
Yeah, it's a real game changer, Auditors are using data analytics more and more to make their audits better, work more efficiently, and find hidden patterns or problems that they might have missed otherwise.
So instead of manually going through tons of data, they can use software to analyze it all and find potential issues.
Right. Think of it like a detective using facial recognition to scan thousands of security camera feeds. It's all about using technology to make audits smarter and more effective.
That makes a lot of sense. And it seems like data analytics is only going to become more important as we get even more data.
Absolutely. Auditors who can use these techniques are going to be in a much better position to deal with the complexities of modern business and give their clients valuable insights.
So as we wrap things up, what are some key takeaways that our listeners should remember?
Well, first of all, auditing is so much more than just ticking boxes and looking at numbers. It's about providing assurance, finding ways to improve things, and helping organizations build trust and confidence.
Yeah, it's about making sure things are accountable, transparent, and ethical.
Exactly. And those principles don't just apply to financial audits, right? We've seen how they're important in IT, performance evaluations, and even data analytics.
And we've learned that auditing is always changing thanks to technology, new regulations, and the fact that businesses are getting more complex all the time.
So auditors need to be flexible, understand technology, and be willing to keep learning throughout their careers.
They also need to be able to think critically, use good judgment, and communicate their findings in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. So whether you're thinking about becoming an auditor or just want to learn more about this field, I hope this deep dive has given you a good starting point and made you curious to learn more.
I agree. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the world of auditing. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into something new and exciting. Until then, keep learning and exploring.